Hey, welcome to DA Tool Brief 0007 as of August 23rd, 2026. In July, reporting on Amazon's warehouse operations described a conflict that should feel familiar to anyone who has ever managed people from a dashboard while standing on a floor that refuses to behave like the dashboard says it should. Amazon has been testing automated labor management systems at a small number of U.S. fulfillment and sortation sites. The systems are designed to recommend where workers should be moved as package volume and workload change. The business logic is easy to understand. Labor is expensive, demand moves. One area can be overloaded while another has excess capacity. If software can see those changes quickly and recommend better staffing moves, the operation should become more efficient. But reporting based on internal documents and employee communications described a problem. Some managers were overriding recommendations, working around automated features, or asking that parts of the system be turned off. Managers reportedly argued that some recommendations did not reflect what they were seeing on the floor. One reported concern was that the system could react too aggressively to a brief slowdown and recommend moving people away before the operating condition had actually changed enough to justify that move. Amazon disputes the idea that it is trying to eliminate manager judgment. The company says the tools are still pilots, are intended to give managers better information, and are being refined through testing and feedback. That distinction matters because we do not have enough public evidence to declare the software right or the managers right. We have a live operating conflict between two reads of the same floor. That is where this becomes useful. Put yourself in the position of an area manager. Your shift is moving. You have a current staffing plan. Package volume is visible. Work in process is visible. Queues are visible. You know which areas are carrying pressure, which associates are trained for which paths, and what the current handoffs look like. Then the system recommends moving labor because one part of the operation appears to have slowed down. At first, the recommendation is defensible. The system may be seeing more of the building than one manager can hold in their head. Ignoring it just because it came from software would be weak leadership. Blindly executing it would be weak too if the manager has a credible reason to believe the signal is incomplete. The slowdown may be temporary. Another system may not have updated, or moving labor may solve one area and create a downstream bottleneck. Those are possibilities, not confirmed Amazon facts, and that distinction matters. The leader already has an initial read. They can see the operation, they can see the recommendation, they can see the conflict. What they do not yet have is the variable that explains why those two reads disagree. A weak leader can hide behind the system. The software said move them. Another can hide behind experience. I know my floor, ignore it. Neither answer is enough. The operating question is not whether human judgment beats software. It is whether the information currently available is sufficient to make the staffing move responsibly. This is also where we need to draw a hard line between this problem and CSA. CSA is the initial situation read. You use the information that is already accessible to you without creating unnecessary disruption just to collect more. You look at what is happening, what matters, what is changing, what pressure exists, what the constraints are, what the people and systems around the problem are showing you, and what the current condition appears to support. You are not launching an investigation every time you need to make a normal operating decision. You are reading the situation from the information already available to the leader. In this Amazon example, the area manager can perform that initial read from the floor condition, current staffing, visible workload, active queues, known associate capability, current operating targets, and the system recommendation. That is CSA territory. The leader is collecting and organizing what is already accessible enough to form the first read. And if the conditions simply change while the operation is moving, CSA still has a tool for that. Dynamic assessment updates the read when new accessible information appears. Volume rises, a queue clears, a carrier arrives late, staffing changes, a system status updates. You do not automatically leave CSA because something changed. You update the read with what has become visible. In-depth analysis begins somewhere else. It begins when you have already done the initial read, and that read exposes a critical variable you cannot answer from the information currently available. The 6 CSA lenses did their job. They did not fail. They brought you far enough to identify the point where the read stops being sufficient. Now you need something new. You may need additional system data that was not available during the initial read. You may need engineering to determine whether there is latency between systems. You may need a deeper workload history to determine whether the slowdown is temporary or structural. You may need labor skill data that the staffing recommendation does not appear to reflect. You may need to test an assumption. You may need access to another system, another data set, another technical resource, or another level of expertise. That acquisition is not the first 6 steps again. That is the diagnostic halt. The distinction can be stated cleanly. CSA asks, what can I responsibly read from the information available to me now? In-depth analysis asks, what do I have to go obtain because the current read cannot support the next move? Think about what actually happened in the Amazon case. The important fact is not that managers resisted automation. Resistance by itself proves nothing. A manager can override a system for a good reason, a bad reason, habit, ego, fear, or simple preference. The important fact is that the pilot exposed disagreement between automated recommendations and some managers' assessment of the operating floor. Once that disagreement appears, the organization has 3 choices. It can force compliance with the recommendation. It can let managers override whenever they want, or it can treat the disagreement as evidence that a variable needs to be understood. The third choice requires discipline from both sides. The manager has to explain what the system appears to be missing. It feels wrong is not enough. The program owner has to inspect whether the recommendation is using delayed, incomplete, or differently weighted information. The model says so is not enough either. The objective is not to protect manager discretion or the algorithm. It is to staff the operation in a way that protects flow, service, labor efficiency, and the next operating window. The initial read should tell you enough to recognize the conflict and whether it is consequential enough to stop. If a staffing move creates little downside and can be reversed immediately, the manager may not need a diagnostic halt. Some uncertainty is normal. But if the recommendation could remove critical capability, shift a bottleneck downstream, affect a customer critical cutoff, or create a condition that is difficult to reverse, then the missing variable can change the decision. That is the threshold. What exactly does the system believe is happening? What does the manager believe is happening? What evidence supports each read? What variable would explain the difference? And would that variable change the staffing move? If the answer to that last question is no, keep moving. If the answer is yes, continuing to act confidently is not decisiveness. It is guessing with authority. The direct action tool for that condition is in-depth analysis. In-depth analysis is a diagnostic halt strategy used when a critical variable blocks responsible action and the decision maker needs more information, expertise, resources, or structured understanding before selecting the next move. The use line is direct. Stop the action path when the missing variable can break the decision. In-depth analysis is not indecision. It is not analysis paralysis. It is not a leader asking for more data because they are uncomfortable making a call. It is not a second CSA because the first assessment somehow did not count. And it is not permission to freeze the whole operation while everybody studies every possible explanation. The halt has to be earned. A critical variable has to exist. That variable has to be missing, unclear, unpredictable, beyond the current resources, or consequential enough that acting without it could produce the wrong move. The leader then stops only the action exposed to that variable, gathers what is needed to resolve it, and returns to the decision path. That difference from CSA is fundamental to the direct action architecture. CSA gives you the read you can build from the information already accessible at the time. It helps you understand the situation before you choose how to navigate it. In-depth analysis lives inside deepen after navigation is already underway and the path hits a hard halt. The leader is not asking, what does the situation look like? They are asking, what specific thing do I now need to know, verify, obtain, or resource before I can responsibly continue? If the answer is already sitting on the dashboard, floor, schedule, queue, current report, or normal conversation, you probably have not reached in-depth analysis yet. Use CSA. Update the read. Keep moving. If the answer requires a new query, test, technical review, additional access, deeper data set, specialized expertise, or resource that was not part of the initial accessible read, then you may have crossed the line. That is also why in-depth analysis comes after manual engagement in the deepen ladder. Sometimes you bring in the right person and discover that even they cannot responsibly act yet. The technical owner needs logs. Quality needs test results. Engineering needs a system trace. The right person is present, but the required read still is not. The problem is no longer access to the person. It is access to understanding. Recognition signals are practical. The team is arguing from two plausible reads and cannot establish which one should control. A decision depends on a system behavior nobody can verify. The consequence of the action changes dramatically depending on one unknown. The person with the right authority says they still need additional evidence before acting, or the only way to answer the question is to obtain information, expertise, tools, or resources that were not available during the original assessment. Those signals do not automatically tell you to analyze for hours. Sometimes one system check, test, log, technical call, or confirmation is enough. In-depth analysis is defined by why the halt exists, not how long it lasts. And if the additional information would not change the decision, do not collect it. If you already know enough to stabilize, intervene, redirect, or manually engage responsibly, use the lower risk fitting tool. In-depth analysis exists for the moment when the missing variable can actually break the decision. That recognition level is where I want to keep this public tool brief. The full inspect method teaches how to define the hard halt, isolate the critical variable, control what stops, acquire the evidence or expertise that matters, compare consequences, set the condition that ends the halt, and return to the correct deepen strategy. That structured execution belongs inside the direct action training. For now, remember the boundary. CSA builds the first responsible read from what you can access. In-depth analysis starts when that read tells you there is something important you cannot access yet. Now move the pattern into manufacturing. A production supervisor is running a customer critical batch. The line is producing. Quality checks have been passing. Then inspection finds a defect in several units. The supervisor can see the lot number, production time, machine settings, operator assignment, current scrap count, and the units that failed. Those are accessible facts. The supervisor can use CSA to build the initial read without tearing apart the entire process. The initial read shows something important. The failed units may share a component lot, but the floor information does not establish whether the issue is isolated to those components or represents a wider process problem. Production wants to keep moving because the shipment window is closing. A manual check is proposed as a temporary control. Now the line appears. If the available inspection data already proves the defect is isolated and the manual check can reliably contain it, this may be a tactical resolution problem. Do not call everything in-depth analysis. But if quality cannot tell from the existing inspection results whether the defect affects one component lot or the entire batch, the initial read has reached its limit. Continuing production could create more scrap, rework, or a quality escape. Stopping indefinitely could miss the customer shipment. The leader needs new information. Quality may need additional samples tested. Engineering may need to inspect the failure mode. Material traceability may need to be pulled beyond what the supervisor could see during the first read, and that is in-depth analysis. CSA identified the situation and exposed the uncertainty. In-depth analysis acquires the missing evidence that decides whether production can continue, needs containment, or requires a more precise correction. And ask the leader-level questions. What do we already know? What critical variable remains unanswered? Can I answer it from the information already available? If not, what must I go get? And will the result actually change what we do next? Now move into healthcare operations. A clinic access manager sees callback volume climbing after a scheduling workflow change. The dashboard shows more calls waiting. Staff report that patients are calling back because they are unsure whether appointments were successfully moved. The manager can see call volume, wait time, staffing, scheduling status, and the messages already sent to patients. That is enough for an initial CSA read. The manager does not need a research project to recognize that the workflow change and callback increase are related operationally. But suppose the next proposed move is to change the scheduling rule again. Before that happens, the manager discovers something the available read cannot answer. They do not know whether the callbacks are coming primarily from patients who received an unclear message, patients whose appointments actually failed to update, or patients whose records show conflicting information across systems. Those are not the same problem. One could require communication correction, another could require system correction, another could require a manual engagement or escalation path. Changing the workflow without knowing which condition is driving the calls could reduce one queue while creating another handoff failure. The initial assessment did its job. It showed the manager where the pressure is and what appears connected to it. In-depth analysis begins when the manager needs information not already present in the initial read. A sample of callback reasons may need to be reviewed. Scheduling records may need comparison across systems. A technical owner may need to confirm whether updates are synchronizing correctly. That additional acquisition should be narrow and tied to the decision. The healthcare boundary matters. This is operations analysis, not medical advice. The leader is not diagnosing patients. They are diagnosing the operating path. The question is the same. What variable, if wrong, changes the move? What information do we have to obtain before changing the workflow again? Now put it in public sector operations. A city public works supervisor has crews scheduled to begin a road maintenance project. The crew, equipment, traffic control plan, and work window are ready. The supervisor can see the schedule, weather forecast, staffing, equipment status, plan closure, and current permit information. That is the initial CSA read. Then a utility conflict appears in the project area. The available map shows infrastructure in the corridor, but the supervisor cannot confirm whether the marked line is exactly where the excavation is planned, or whether the map reflects the current field condition. The pressure says, keep the schedule. Crews are already assigned. Equipment is staged. Delaying work costs time and creates another closure window. But the missing variable can break the decision. The supervisor cannot resolve that variable by staring harder at the same map. The initial accessible information has reached its limit. The organization may need a utility locate, field verification, updated record, engineering review, or another resource that was not available during the first assessment. That is not CSA taking too long. That is in-depth analysis doing its job. The disciplined halt may affect only the exposed excavation activity. Other preparation may continue. The point is not to freeze everything. The point is to stop the action that could create unacceptable consequences until the variable controlling that action is understood. The same distinction applies to a permit manager who discovers a code interpretation cannot be resolved from the current record, a grant manager who learns a funding condition is unclear, or a field supervisor who finds that a planned response depends on infrastructure information nobody can verify from the available system. The first read tells you what is happening. The diagnostic halt tells you what you have to go obtain before you can responsibly act on it. Across Amazon's warehouse pilot, the manufacturing defect, the clinic callback problem, and the public works utility conflict, the surface conditions change, but the decision pattern stays stable. First, the leader builds a responsible initial read from accessible information. That is CSA territory. Then the operation reaches a point where the next action depends on a specific variable the current read cannot resolve. The variable matters enough that getting it wrong could change the move or create unacceptable downstream consequences. The leader stops only the exposed action, obtains the missing evidence, expertise, access, or resource, and returns to the action path when the decision condition becomes clear. The tool is the point, the situation is the proof. This is also why in-depth analysis cannot become a badge leaders wear to sound thoughtful. We need more data can be one of the easiest ways to avoid a decision. If you cannot name the missing variable, you probably do not have a diagnostic halt. If you cannot explain how the answer could change the decision, you probably do not need the analysis. If the information is already accessible and you simply have not done the initial read, go back to CSA. And if conditions are merely changing, update the read. Dynamic assessment exists for that, and the escalation into in-depth analysis should cost something. It costs time, attention, expertise, access, testing, or resources. That cost is justified only because acting without the missing variable creates a greater risk to the objective. That is what makes the Amazon example useful, even though the pilot outcome is still unresolved. We do not know whether the managers who overrode recommendations were consistently right. We do not know whether the automated systems will eventually outperform local judgment. We do not know which manager overrides reflected legitimate missing context and which reflected habit or resistance to change. Amazon says the systems remain in pilot testing, and manager feedback is part of the refinement process. Time will tell whether the organization uses those disagreements to identify variables the systems are not yet capturing, improves the recommendations, and defines when human intervention adds value, or whether it decides that tighter enforcement produces better outcomes despite the resistance. But the current evidence already gives us the leadership lesson. A conflicting signal is not proof that the system is wrong. It is not proof that the manager is wrong. It is a reason to determine whether a missing variable can break the decision. Before we close, look at one decision already moving through your operation. Start with the CSA boundary. What information is already available to you right now? What can you see, verify, hear, measure, or reasonably access without creating a separate investigation? Have you actually completed that initial read? Or are you calling for analysis because you have not used the information already sitting in front of you? Then look at the next move. Is there one variable you cannot answer from that initial read? Would the answer change the action? What happens if you move without it? What would you have to obtain that you do not currently possess? Is that a new data set, a test, a specialist review, deeper system access, an external confirmation, or a resource you did not have when the first read was built? And be careful with your own resistance. Are you stopping because the missing variable genuinely threatens the decision, or because more analysis feels safer than ownership? In-depth analysis is not the place you go when CSA feels incomplete. It is the place you go when CSA has done its job, the action path is moving, and the read exposes a critical unknown that requires something beyond the information you initially had. This has been DA Tool Brief 0007, In-Depth Analysis. Amazon's warehouse staffing pilot gives us a current example of the tension. Automated recommendations and local manager judgment are sometimes producing different answers. The public evidence does not tell us which side will ultimately prove more accurate, and that is exactly why the case fits. The responsible move is not to worship the model or worship experience. It is to understand what variable explains the disagreement, and whether that variable changes the decision. When you are ready to move from recognizing the hard halt to building the full diagnostic process, the complete in-depth analysis method is taught inside the direct action training. Until then, keep one question in front of you. What decision are you still trying to force from the information you already have when the next responsible move requires you to go obtain something you do not?